Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Translation Notes, Mark 14, 1 through 9, Part 2. We started Mark back in October of 2021, and we are not too far from the end of the book. We are in Mark 14, 1 through 9 for the second time today, and we'll take another week next week to finish this passage. The description of this webinar is using accordance. I will guide us through some of the lexical and grammatical questions that arise when translating the Greek text of Mark into English. And I want to note again that the focus of this series is more on the Greek text and translation per se than it is on accordance features, although we will be using accordance the whole time and making use of various features. But if you're looking for something more feature focused, learning the app itself, I'll just point you to the help menu up here once you have the Accordance app open. And if you go to Accordance help, that will open up a whole bunch of documentation on the app. And then there's also a link to the webinars page where we've got pre-recorded webinars. So you can check that out if you're looking for something more feature focused. As well, if you want to go back and look at more Mark Translation Notes webinars, those are recorded as well. Mark 14:3 is where we're going to start today in just a moment. Before we do, I want to make sure that you're aware that this handout that I'm showing on my screen is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel if you're here live. That control panel is what you see when you log in. There's a section that says handouts, and you can click that open. You can also find this handout and all the other ones for this series in tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That's just a URL shortcut to a shared Google Drive folder where I'm putting all the handouts for this series. You can also email me here, abramkj@accordancebible.com. If you've got comments or questions at any time, feel free to put them in the questions box. That's a one-way typed chat that will find its way to me, and I will respond to you either privately or I'll anonymously share your comment or question with the group and respond to it that way. So with that said, let's review where we were last time. That was Mark 14, 1 through 2. It says, now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were 2 days away, and the chief priests and the law experts were sneakily seeking how to detain him, Jesus, so that they could kill him. For they had said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. And now we shift to this house in verse 3. And so we've got some background here. Mark's kind of stepping back and taking something of a 30,000 foot view to where we are and when we are and the backdrop and what's going on. And so that's present, but Mark doesn't really elaborate on either of these verses explicitly in what follows. Although there is going to be, at the end of this section, Jesus is going to make a pretty clear allusion to the fact that he is not always going to be with people. So that will come up. But we otherwise shift to a new scene, and that starts in verse 3. So I've got this in the handout. Let me shift over to Accordance here, and we'll read it through. Kai antas autu in Bethania en te oikia Simonas tu lepru. Kata ke menu autu elthen gune ekusa alabastron muru nardu. Pistikes, palutelus, sun tripsasa ten alabastron katekein autu tes kephales. Let's just go left to right, and then I'll shift back to the handout. But left to right, something like, and or now, being in Bethany, him, in the house of Simon, who had leprosy, or Simon the leper, reclining him. So then we're going to see that this actually is what's called a genitive absolute. So This is a standalone clause, so it would be something like, now while he was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table. And then we finally get the main verb. I'll shift to the handout for all this in a moment. But a woman came, or there arrived a woman, gune, who had or having, and then we'll have to work our way through this translation, but it's something like an alabaster jar of ointment or perfume of nard, pure or unadulterated and expensive. Breaking the alabaster jar, she poured it, or the contents, over his head. So not the easiest verse to just go left to right. And part of that is the word order. Part of that is this genitive absolute that we'll talk about in just a moment. Part of that is we've got some vocabulary here that's challenging. I'm hovering over this word for alabaster jar. If I just hit the command key, I'm here on Mac and hitting the command key, it toggles to my preferred dictionary, but also shows me the word count. So that occurs just 4 times. Ointment or perfume 14 times, nard 2 times. None of these are probably household words in 21st century United States or whatever country you might be in. So we'll struggle through that together a little bit. But this verse does provide a number of translational challenges. Here's how I rendered it, and I'd consider this a provisional translation, something that I might want to look at a little bit more if I were to actually go to print with this. But now, while he was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table, a woman came who had an alabaster jar of expensive ointment of pure nard. Breaking open the jar, she poured the contents on his head. Now, you could say a woman who had an alabaster jar of expensive ointment of pure nard came. Grammatically, that is a little bit more consistent with how we typically use English, that you would get the subject and its modifiers and then the verb. So it may feel a little awkward to say a woman came who had. I did that though, because with a woman who had an alabaster jar of I mean, like before you even get through the clause, you get lost because you're waiting for the verb. So I put that there. Greek, of course, has the advantage that it can put the verb even before the subject. So you've got in Greek something like, there came a woman who had, or came a woman who had. You could even do that in English. There came a woman who had. But that's something to think about just stylistically. How does this read in English? But the word order in Greek, of course, you've got the verb fronted here. Breaking open the jar, so we've got a participle there. Soon tripsasa, she poured the contents on his head. I mentioned this genitive absolute at the beginning, and it's so called because, well, here's the genitive. If we are not remembering our endings here, then we can hover over the instant details, but this ontos, present participle masculine singular genitive with the os ending there, autou for the subject, genitive, ou, and then there's another genitive absolute, katakemenu autou. And the only reason they're not right next to each other is because you've got this modifier of where he was. He was in Bethany at the house or in the house of Simon the leper. But everything that I've highlighted right here, before you get to the main verb of eilthein and the main subject, the main actor of gune, the woman, you've got this genitive absolute. And I've shared this before because we see it pretty often in Mark, but here's from Mounce in his Basics of Biblical Greek textbook. He defines this genitive absolute is a noun or pronoun, so autou, it's a pronoun in both cases, and a participle. So we've got a double one here. We've got ontos, that's one participle. We've got katakemenu, another one. Genitive absolute is a noun or pronoun and a participle in the genitive, check, that are not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. In other words, there will be no word elsewhere in the sentence that the participial phrase modifies. typically when we see a participle like akusa, having, we're looking for something else that it modifies. And in this case, akusa is modifying the woman who came. And that participle goes with this verb here. Antas and kata kemenu as participles don't have their own main verb with Jesus as the subject that they modify. So it's a genitive absolute. And we translate it as if it's just its own indicative phrase. Here, in this case, it is modifying, if not a pure grammatical connection, it's modifying what's happening and when and where. So now, while he was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table. So that's all the double genitive absolute there. And then we get to the main subject and verb. A woman came who had an alabaster jar. I've pointed this out before. I'll point it out again because it comes up so often. If you go to add parallel diagrams of the Greek New Testament, you can see how these diagrams give us the genitive absolute. Just a quick refresher, these diagrams have a horizontal line that is split by a vertical line. Everything at the left of the vertical line is the subject and its modifiers. Everything at the right of the vertical line is the predicate and its modifiers, so everything that's said about the subject. And in this case, we have the line coming down here, but these brackets here, anytime you see those in the diagrams tool, it's meant to show you that, as Mount says, grammatically, this is not connected to the rest of the sentence. Of course, it is connected. It's logically connected. It's describing some detail about the scene, but the brackets will indicate that. So that's the genitive absolute. Mark uses it pretty often, and he uses it again here, and it's to modify or to set up the situation. So that's in your handout, more notes on that. And of course, any of your grammars, you could open up a grammar or even your research window and type in genitive absolute. We won't go through the results, but I'll just demonstrate very briefly how to do that. File, new tab, research, genitive absolute. And you could even just search your grammars and you'll see a lot of different material in there, depending on what grammars you have. So that's worth looking at more if you want to. All right, so Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table. Before we move to the woman, let's talk about Simonas tu leprou and how we might understand that and how we might translate that, and also, importantly, who that is. Simon the leper, nowhere else mentioned in Mark. Tu leprou is a distinctive feature here to identify him likely as a particular Simon among several. So you can see this if you triple click on Simonas. Of course, that's in the genitive because it's in the house of Simon. But if you triple click that, you'll go to Simon, who you'll see here in BDAG. And you've got a number of options here. Of course, we think about Simon Peter, but there are other Simons that that just saying Simon could refer to. Here's our Simon under consideration. France notes that this host Simon is otherwise unknown. In fact, he's not in Mark. We can confirm this by going to this phrase, right-clicking and searching for. Now, we don't want to search for inflected because it's in the genitive case here, and this could be in any case, nominative maybe he's the subject of something. So we broaden our search to search for lexeme. And in fact, we see Simon the leper. This phrase in particular only occurs in Matthew 26:6, which looks like the parallel passage here, and in Mark 14:13. So no other information about this person. France says in his New International Greek Testament commentary, the host Simon is otherwise unknown, presumably a local supporter of Jesus like Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And in fact, we're in Bethany here too. The fact that he could host a meal in his house indicates that his title, ha lepros, did not literally denote his present condition, because he would have been considered not clean to eat a meal with. He may have been a former leper, now cured by Jesus, ? Or may have acquired his nickname by some other association, which we cannot now know. The name Simon was so common that some distinguishing title was needed. And if you compare different commentaries, you're going to see them say much the same thing. This idea of this leprosy being a former condition, it's cured, by Jesus ? I think I saw that in like 5 different commentaries as I was preparing for today. But let's talk about an important translation issue, and this has to do with the kind of 2 different worlds that we're inhabiting when we translate. One is the world of the text and how a thing would have been named and known and understood, and the other is the world that we live in now and how things are named and known and understood. The CEV, the Common English Version, has Simon who once had leprosy. That's how it translates it. In fact, you might even just live click here, go to the gear icon, make sure verse lookup is selected. This would be worth, and you just click the reference, and now you get Simon the leper, Simon the leper. Common English Bible gives us Simon who had a skin disease. That's interesting. And in fact, what we're not doing right now, you could do this, is think about, do you want to translate this as leprosy or as quote unquote skin disease? That's a consideration. But at any rate, here we have Simon who had a skin disease, Simon the leper, Simon the leper. Predominantly, you're going to get in translation Simon the leper, but it's interesting that here we're seeing Simon who had a skin disease. And the difference, and in fact, here's Holman Christian Standard Bible, Simon who had a serious skin disease. Now, the difference in naming has to do with, and this is a 21st century construction, what would be called person first identifier versus an identity first identifier. So person first is you name the person as a person, and then the thing that's being used to distinguish him from other Simons is something that is true about him, but it's not the totality of his identity. So Simon who had or has leprosy, that was person first. Or and you think about that too today, and how you might name a person who has a disability versus a disabled person, or Simon the disabled. That would generally be seen as not a naming convention we might want to use now. Identity first is Simon the leper. So where the kind of 2 worlds thing comes in here is I can pretty much guess that the identity first naming is what's present there in the 1st century. And we get that with Simon to lepreux, Simon of leprosy. I don't know that you could translate that literally as Simon who had leprosy. This does seem to be kind of a stock title. But in translation, just think about that. How does that come off in our translation to readers who might be aware of this distinction between person first versus identity first? The advantage to this translation that we see in a couple translations, well, there's actually 2 advantages. One, if you say Simon who once had leprosy, it doesn't totalize him according to his disease. He is not just Simon the leper, he is Simon the person who has leprosy. So I like that in translation, although you see here in my provisional translation, I just did Simon the leper. But the other advantage to naming it this way is that you can make it clearer in your translation, something that your reader might not grasp immediately, which is that this leprosy is in the past tense, that he once had leprosy, Simon who had leprosy. So I think this kind of translation is advantageous. Number one, because it's person first and honors his dignity in the naming. And number two, I think it brings out this nuance that they presumably would not be in the home if he had leprosy. Now, there's much more here historically to look at. that I would start with the SIL exegetical commentary on this, or even a Bible background commentary. But it would be worth just kind of checking through everything around leprosy. And in fact, you'll see here from Keener, if Simon had been a leper, nicknames usually had some basis, but were not always meant literally. He was certainly not one by this point. If present, no one would have joined him for dinner if he had been. Jesus may have healed him. So you'll see this in lots of commentaries. So again, I would just, if you want to do more research on leprosy and what was that looking like here at this point in the first century in Bethany in particular, that's worth looking at. But I think it's pretty strong confirmation from everything I've read that Simon does not now have leprosy. So again, it's a question. We'll see this question again too when we get to 300 denarii in a moment. Do we leave the work of translation for our readers, or do we do as much as possible without also over translating? So there's a tension here, and of course there will be different approaches to this, and we saw different approaches even in translation. Most translations have Simon the leper. A number of other ones name him Simon, who had leprosy, which again gives us that person first translation, but also I think really brings out that nuance that he is not actually a person with leprosy right now. All right, well, that's a lot on one phrase, but I thought it was worth pointing out and worth thinking through. So now on to the woman who is the focus of this. And you know, with Simon, we just really don't have much. I mean, this question mark here is totally appropriate. We don't know how he was healed. I mean, you know, that seems like very reasonable. Jesus is a healer. You know, we could see is leprosy in Mark at previous points, and sure enough, we've got one instance in Mark 1:40, and so Jesus is healing this person. Theoretically, it is even possible that this person is Simon, but there's just not a whole lot about this in Mark. There's a little bit here, but anyway, he's an important person because he's hosting this meal. And now the focus shifts from him, as important as he is, to this woman. So we're going to move now to the woman. But before we do that, let me just pause and see what questions or comments you have. We talked about the genitive absolute. We didn't really talk about this verb reclining at the table. You could look at that in your lexicons. We talked about the naming of Simon, who he is. We'll move on to the woman in a moment, but let me just check in with you if you've got questions or comments. Here's a comment. I'll put this in the chat. Somebody says on the genitive absolutes, two separate genitive absolutes, since not connected with the chi, diagram did not reflect that. Yeah, let's just open that up and look again briefly. Oops, let me open it in this window. Right, there's not a chi, and I'm not sure that a chi needs to connect a compound genitive absolute. It may. That would actually be an interesting thing to search and to see when there is a genitive absolute with multiple genitives, is chi typically used? I think I would expect it, but that would be an interesting search to run, and there are ways that you could do that. It would take a little while to build, but yeah, that's an interesting point. All right, well, let's look at the woman now. So we've got eothein gune. So finally, the main verb, and again, you can see this here in the diagram, that everything else is grammatically subordinate to this. So the woman came, and so here's a participle, having, or who had. Let me go to my notes here. Yeah, what did she have? Well, this is where there are a number of different translation options, and BDAG will be helpful here. Your commentaries will be helpful. Live click will be helpful. I think one question is, again, you know, will our readers or listeners, or even ourselves as we look at our translation later, will we know what the English words mean? Let me open up the NET Bible. So we've got a woman who comes with an alabaster jar, and we have a little text note there. A jar made of alabaster stone was normally used for very precious substances like perfumes. It normally had a long neck which was sealed and had to be broken off so the contents could be used. So we've got the alabaster jar of ointment. Here we get aromatic oil and a long note here that has to do with myrrh, which is how we can, I mean, you can see that in the Greek there. Let me go back to this NET note and open it here. Yeah, myrrhon was usually made of myrrh, from which the English word is derived, but here it is used in the sense of ointment or perfumed oil. And you get a hyperlink to another lexicon here. So I would translate that either as ointment or oil. Then when we get to nardu, or nardu for nard, an aromatic plant from which oil of nard is derived, an aromatic oil of the spikenard plant. I suppose the question is, will anybody reading know what nard is? That doesn't mean you don't translate it that way. It could be an obscure plant that someone has to look up. That's fine. In fact, I've rendered it nard too. Maybe spikenard helps. But here you get costly aromatic oil from pure nard, which is an interesting way. We'll come to these adjectives in a moment, but this is an interesting way to cover this, I think, because it both renders nardu as nard, and with calling it aromatic oil tells you what it is. So I think that's an elegant translation. You'll see something like this in the SIL Exegetical Summary Series 2. You've got nard, spikenard, perfume of nard, oil of nard. This noun denotes an aromatic oil extracted from a plant called nard. Translators normally borrow the term nard and employ some type of classifier, such as a perfume called nard or a sweet smelling substance, comma, nard. And that's what we saw the NET doing. So this, I think, is a really efficient and elegant way to translate the Greek word with what the Greek word is, what it meant then, but also bring out in English what the thing is. I mean, I don't think about nard outside of this passage. And I mean, maybe if I were a perfumer, it would be a little bit differently, but probably not even then. So I think this solution here is a really good one, a perfume called nard, or this option, a sweet smelling substance that is nard. So you're defining it there. You're not using a whole lot of words to do it. You're still keeping your translation nice and succinct. You're being faithful to the Greek text and doing it in a way that I think is a little clearer to whoever's reading the translation. And you could look at different translations too to see how they render this. Let me know if you have comments or questions on that. Any of these words I think we could look at more closely, whether it's using lexicons or doing historical background research, or opening up your Bible plant encyclopedia. There's somewhere we've got I'm not sure, something about flora and fauna. It could be worth, well, but you'd need perfume too. But anyway, this is something you could do a research search on in your library and see if you've got resources that talk more in depth about this. What Mark does, though, is he gives us this little bit of alliteration, this pistikes palutelus, that describes this costly aromatic oil of pure nard. This first word, and you can see here the root connection to pistis, as in faith or faithful or pure. You've got this unadulterated, unfiltered, something like that, genuine, unadulterated. And then with palutelus, you've got expensive, costly. So I'm often wanting to ask the question, as a translator and as someone who wants to follow Mark on Mark's terms, what is the author doing now? And what he's doing here is, on the one hand, he's showing just how pure, unfiltered, undiluted the gift is. and how expensive it is. He does that with those two words. So we could understand this first word, pistikes, as having to do with the purity or unfilteredness or undilutedness or the fullness of the gift. And then this palutelus is how expensive or costly it is. Now, I'm a preacher, and it is not hard for me to see a connection here, not hard for any of us to see a connection here to thinking about gifts of worship. That's not going to come into my translation, but I do think that Mark is both referring to the thing offered, but there's also something in here about how it's offered. And we'll come to that, in fact, as the passage goes on. There's going to be this explicit um, uh, kind of explanation of this woman, this praising of her by Jesus, what she has done. But already, even here, in explaining or describing the ointment in this way, Mark is saying something like, she's holding nothing back because this is the good stuff, and it costs. So again, there's lots of directions, lots of ways that will preach, as my friend used to say, that'll preach. But I think also in terms of just what's Mark doing to focus us, where's he going in the narrative? This gift, and it could have been another kind of ointment, it could have been another kind of perfume. So I think, yes, take some time, and maybe even more time than we're doing now, to think about how you want to translate this. But whatever happened to be in that alabaster jar, I think at least as important is the fact that this was genuine, unfiltered, pure, expensive, and it all is going to the next word, soon tripsasa, which ought to, I think Mark, with these two words here, is getting us ready to get shocked. So pistikes palutelus shows what the gift is, but maybe something about how it's offered. But now, when the next word is shatter or break, breaking open the jar, there's some shock there. This is really good stuff, and that jar is there to protect it, to preserve it. This is not stuff that you're just carrying around in your cupped hands, where it might slosh around and spill out. I mean, there's some real care here because of the value of the thing. So this soon tripsasa, I think, even in how Mark is positioning this story, and how he's giving us these two adjectives here right before the breaking of it, I think he's setting us up for some shock, which in fact is what is going to happen in verse 4 in the initial event. So breaking open the jar, ten alabastron, you could say breaking open the alabaster jar again if you wanted to. She poured it on his head, or she poured the contents on his head. She's not really pouring the jar per se on his head. So even though it's not saying she poured the perfume or the ointment on his head, think about how you bring that out. I just put she poured the contents on his head in brackets. I pointed out this, how the NASB will often give us, where words are not present in the text, they'll give it to us in italics. Here they just say she broke the vial and poured it over his head. But again, she's not technically pouring it, meaning the jar or the seal, over his head. She's pouring the content. So you might just think about bringing that out in translation. Yeah, here's the NET. After breaking open the jar, she poured it on his head. If you think it implies the contents of the jar already, then great. Personally, I see this grammatically as it could refer to jar. To avoid confusion, I think something like she poured the contents on his head, because that is in fact what she poured on his head. All right, that's verse 3. We won't spend as much time on the rest of the verses, but I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in here, grammatically, with the genitive absolute, this idea of naming, and how do we conceive of that. Of course, there's a lot of words to look at here, maybe some more historical background research. I think rhetorically, Mark is setting us up for shock with these modifiers, and then we get the woman pouring this all over his head. So the reaction comes next in verse 4. But let's pause to see what questions or comments folks have before we move on. Here's a comment. I'm going to put this in the chat. Somebody's sharing more on this ointment of spikenard, very precious. The alabaster box was a flask of fragrant oil. The special kind of ointment named by the evangelist nard or spikenard was extracted from the blossoms of the Indian and Arabian nard grass from Becker's Gallus. All right, thank you. And I put that in the chat. And you may find too that as you look at this and study it more, you may think of, I mean, that will help you not just with historical background, but also with how you want to translate it. Here's another comment. Let me put this in the chat. Somebody else says, this woman was the only one who got to anoint Jesus' body. Those at the tomb missed as he had risen. Interesting. Yeah. Like the prepared virgins, or yeah, the ones who were to be ready. She was ready and moved when the time was right, available. Great comment. That will preach too. Here's another comment. I might ask you to elaborate on this. On his head does not have epi, the preposition simply an ablative, meaning an around. Oh, I see. So you're suggesting a translation of pouring around his head. Feel free to clarify if I've missed this. Yeah, kateke and autu tes kefali. So we've got a genitive there. That would be interesting. And you know, this is the kind of grammatical question that I often wish my Greek Testament commentary from France or some of the other ones would cover. And often this level of detail just seems to be missing. But let's take just a moment to see what we can find, and do feel free to elaborate on that comment. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. So breaking the flask, she poured it over his head, but that's not going to speak to the autu there, because we just get poured it autu tes kephales. We don't get a preposition in here. Let's see if France has anything. He may not. Oh, he's got a lot here though. Yeah, I don't think we're going to get much there. And then the last place I would check, or maybe the first place, would be the SIL exegetical summary series. They give us poured on his head. And I think that's just coming from the genitive of autu, that's implied there. So we don't have a preposition here, but the pouring it on his head and pouring it around his head wouldn't really, as far as I know, I mean, that's not how you would anoint a person. So I think that's a justified translation. But do feel free to add a follow-up. All right, on to verse 4. So the reaction, well, we can see this coming. Let's go to the Greek. Esan de tines aganaktuntes pros heautus. Esti he apolea haute tumuru geganen. Let's go left to right. But some were indignant to themselves. We're going to have to come back to this. Why why this waste of ointment or oil, just follow your translation from before, happen? Why did this waste of ointment happen? Here's how I've rendered it. But some of those there, that's in brackets because that's not in the text, but it I think makes for a little smoother English. But some of those there were indignant, saying to one another, why has this ointment been wasted? We get a periphrastic participle, this esan and aganaktuntes. So it's just a form of me, the to be verb, plus a participle. But some were indignant, or some, let's see how the NET renders this. Interestingly, they say some who were present indignantly said to one another. So you may have some options to think through. Some were indignantly remarking to one another. All right, so that's interesting. What's hard about this verse is we don't get the say verb. We don't get legantes, which we would expect. So the pros heautus, saying to one another, if you assume that legantes fits there, then the pros heautus, that reflexive to one another, describes the saying. Without legantes there, it's also possible that this aga noctuntes, that they were indignant and kind of amongst themselves, and they wouldn't be indignant toward pros each other. I don't think that really makes sense. But this is not easy to translate just because that saying word, verb is not included. But we do know for sure. I mean, this is speech. I mean, there's not really any question about that. So we're well justified to put the word saying in there. But it's just interesting to see how different translations deal with this. That they make that indignancy an adverb to the saying. So I I would spend personally, if before I were going to feel great about my translation, I would spend a lot more time on this. But I think it's, I mean, at least provisionally, I think this is a pretty good, gives us a pretty good sense of what the Greek is doing. Now, this some of those there, not at all grammatically necessary. I mean, in fact, what Mark is saying is just this: but some were indignant. Tines, some, and that's it. We never find out who the some are. And the sum of those there is also redundant because, of course, we're only looking at this scene with the people that are in the scene. So I put this in brackets. I may not keep that in my final translation if I were to, try to polish this or publish it or something like that. Um, but I did put that in there because the some were indignant. Just felt like stylistically it needed something for smooth English. But again, live click, look at your different translations. You're probably just going to get there were some of those present, but then you have here just some grew angry, or there were some who were indignant. Some were expressing indignation. So you'll get some different ideas there for how you might translate that. But up or down, previous verses or following verses, Mark does not elaborate on who the some are. The quote goes on in verse 5, and they were scolding her, and then Jesus responds. And there's nothing really in his speech that identifies them, and there's nothing even in the setup to this. So we just don't know who the some are. And so what that means is that we preserve that ambiguity in translation as much as still, stylistically makes sense in English. But yeah, are these disciples? Are these, religious leaders? Is it some combination? We don't know because Mark doesn't identify who it is. I thought this phrase was interesting. I'll just say this and then actually ready to move on to verse 5. Or to take questions, but this st he apolea haute tumuru geganen. It is literally something like, why has this waste of ointment happened? And this, I think, is easier to see with the diagrams again. So we see how they put legantes there in parentheses, because it's implied, and it's here grammatically to set up the speech, but it's not in the text. And by the way, these diagrams, I mean, there is some interpretation involved. I mean, it's not biblical text per se. But here we have he apolea haute tumuru. So this waste of myrrh, and then happened. Why? So why has this ointment, not myrrh, sorry, ointment, why has this ointment been wasted is literally something more like, why has this waste of ointment happened, or why has there been this waste of ointment? So why the waste this, why this waste of ointment has there been? That's what the Greek text is doing. And these, I think, are a little bit more one-to-one in translation. Why has this waste of ointment happened? But I think in English we would probably say something more like, why has there been, or yeah, why has there been this waste of ointment, or even just why has this ointment been wasted? Maybe that's not a part of translation that anyone's losing sleep over, but that's what's happening with the Greek. I personally stumbled over this enough that I wanted to see and share with you all, I think, a more one-to-one translation. But I don't know that these read super smoothly. So I do like, why has this ointment been wasted, which is what you'll see in most translations anyway. Let's look at this word indignant briefly. And I don't know that I didn't put a note in here for verse 4. But BDAG gives us, for a translation equivalent, be aroused, indignant, angry. So those are translation equivalents in bold and italics. That's how BDAG formats that. And so that's to really help you as a translator and say, here's a gloss. But then the full definition of BDAG is be indignant against what is assumed to be wrong. And that's important to note here that, again, we don't, Mark, not only does he not tell us who these people are, he also doesn't tell us about their motives. So if we take a charitable, good faith read of their question, which is not necessarily the right way to read it, we just don't know. There's plenty of times that people ask Jesus questions in good faith, and plenty of times they ask him questions in bad faith. We just don't know. But it's interesting that this indignant word is connected here to what is assumed to be wrong. So they're not just mad for the sake of being mad. They're mad because they think that what she did was wrong, or they're going to posture themselves as ones who care about right and wrong, but they really don't. Maybe they're using it as a pretense. Again, we don't know. We've seen examples of both in Mark, but this is interesting here that the indignancy in this meaning has to do with what is assumed to be wrong. And in fact, they are going to elaborate on this. Why has this ointment been wasted? We are indignant because that was wrong, because what is right is what's coming up in the next verse, which we're going to get to in just a moment. So let me stop there. We'll do verse 5 in just a moment, but here we've got the reaction. Some were indignant, saying to one another, why has this ointment been wasted? And then we'll continue their speech in just a moment, but let me check in, see what you've got. Here's an interesting comment. Someone says a verbal paraphrastic phrases emphasizes the duration, so they were continuing to grumble during the entire anointing time frame. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there may be a good way to bring that out in translation too. I think the saying to one another may do that, but there may be a better way to do what you're describing than is done here. So some of those there were being indignant, something like that. But yeah, I appreciate that note that there's it's not just this sort of like quick, sharp flash of anger. I mean, they're mad and it's going to extend. Yeah, thanks for that. Any other comments or questions? These are great. All right, well, again, we can wonder about who these people are. We can wonder about their motives. We don't know. Mark doesn't say. So we just translate what we have, which is, but some were indignant, saying to one another, why has this ointment been wasted? And again, however you translated muru earlier, whether it was ointment or perfume, I would just say be consistent with it in verse 4. So verse 5, we get the word again. Let's go to accordance for verse 5. And this will be the last verse we do today. Eduna tagar tuta ta muran, prathenai epano denarion tria kasion, kai dothenai tois tochois, kai enebrimonta aute. Left to right, we get something like for could have, so it's imperfect, this ointment, So then we have to rearrange the word order. For this ointment could have been prothenai sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. The idea being, and the money given to the poor. So there's a little bit of eliding there. Greek is kind of leaving out what we could make explicit in English, but the money given to the poor. And they upbraided her, they rebuked her, they scolded her, they censured her. I mean, you've got a lot of good English words for this that we could use. So I've translated it this way: for this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 coins and the proceeds given to the poor, and they rebuked her. Now, we alluded to this before. I alluded to this before, but this idea of 300 denarii, and I think this is just such an interesting translation question. And to me, it's back to that two worlds question. I don't know that there's one way that's more faithful to the Greek text per se. I mean, I suppose denarius, translating it as denarius, is more literal, but in terms of translation, you've got the one world, which is where everybody there would know what 300 silver coins or denarii were worth. Probably most everyone reading your translation will not know what that's worth. Now, that doesn't mean you can't translate it that way. You can expect readers to do work with texts in translation, just like any of us have to work to read anything sometimes. We have to look up words in English depending on what we're reading. So it's not like that's, a translation no-no, but it is something to think about. And you will have everything ranging from 300 denarii to the NET gives us 300 silver coins. So that kind of splits the difference a little bit. It describes a denarius as a silver coin and gives you the number. And then the NIV does the math for us, which for me as a reader gives me the meaning right away: a year's wages. How much are they talking about? So that's a range of translation options. I suppose you could do something like, I mean, this adds more words, but you could say something like, this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. That is a year's wages. But because it's a quote, I wouldn't do that because they're not actually elaborating. You're elaborating. So maybe a footnote in your Bible, maybe a study note, or maybe you follow the NIV here. But again, this is a good place to go to live click. Just make sure you've got verse lookup selected and then click on the verse reference. I'm going to change this to modern text so that I just get English translations. And let me make this font. Well, here, let me just make this window bigger. All right, so we've got 300 shillings. That's an interesting translation. We've got denarii here, almost a year's pay, 300 denarii. And then here's denarii with a footnote, although there it is. Look at that. A denarius equals 1 day's wage. So that's a really good way to do it. If you want to do all of the above, which is like if it's really important to you to preserve the word denarius in Greek in your English translation, then you could add just a brief footnote: a denarius equals this, or 300 denarii equal a year's wages. So that's a decision that you would have to make. 300 pence, I don't know that I would do that because that's introducing another kind of currency. But the point is, I mean, that's a lot of money. And the other thing that's helpful about a year's wages is that it does sort of automatically adjust for inflation. So if the denarius was still in use today, it would be presumably a lot more than 300 denarii. So I think a year's wages is nice. What I would not do personally, and you may, but I would not be so context specific as to say, all right, well, I'm translating this in 2025 for my congregation in Boston, and the median annual income in Boston is, I don't know what it is. Let's say $50,000. Not a living wage in Boston, but let's just say $50,000. I would not translate this as this ointment could have been sold for more than $50,000 and given to the poor, because that to me is a little too context specific. So I think a year's wages splits the difference just fine. 50,000 in Boston is going to need to be like 70,000 in San Francisco, but it could be like 30,000 in Tulsa. So a year's wages, I think, does everything. But again, just something to think through. Now, if you wanted to research this unit of measure more, you could do that. But I think this is also a good point to say, well, wait a second. Did we have a denarius elsewhere in Mark? And what did I do there? In fact, Mark 6:37, 200 denarii worth of bread. Mark 12:15, bring me a denarius and let me see it. So I'm not going to go through this whole process right now, but what I would do here is sort of a consistency spot check and just see what have I been doing all along the way. And well, I'm not going to take the time to go through this, but I would just go back and see what did I do in my translations there. Let's just keep it consistent throughout. I think that's probably, that might even be more important than how you actually translate it. Just, don't translate it denarius here and then translate it a year's wages here. I think some kind of consistency is useful so that your readers then can kind of peg it back to this same word that's being used throughout. All right, so again, we're not told anything about their motives, but we are given a sense of how costly this is. So again, I mean, back to the $50,000 number, wherever you live, I mean, that's a ton of money to just be dumping on somebody. And so they rebuked her. That's their response. And Jesus is going to rebuke their rebuke, essentially. So we see that they are in the wrong. But this word enebrimonta, they rebuked. I think we looked that up already. BDAG gave us scold or censure for that. Let me pull that up one more time. Yeah. Worth seeing too, if that's used elsewhere in Mark. In fact, we have Jesus doing that in 143, which is very interesting. Is this the leper too? Yeah, really interesting. I'm not sure that that's a lexical link so much as a coincidence, but in this other passage about the healed leper, he does sternly warn him. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that this word has the same exact meaning in both places. Now, if we, and we have to think theologically here for a moment, but assuming a morally blameless Jesus, his stern warning would have nothing wrong in it or sinful or with bad motives. So even with the same word, here we don't get the same sense. We don't know who these people are, but we know that, I mean, again, a theological belief that nobody is morally perfect. I think we can safely assume that of these people. So I would not feel the need here to do that same kind of consistency check. I think the way in which Jesus embryomized people is going to be with a different set of motives and from a different place and a different place of authority than whoever these people are who are scolding this woman. So think about that. For whatever reason, we do have a lot of words in the English language in this kind of rebuke, scold, censure family, but they very much call her out in front of other people. We don't get the sense that she was doing this to be seen by people, but it was seen by people. So it was a public act, even if it was meant in some sense to be a private devotion to Jesus. Again, there's just details we don't get here, but this censure seems to be very public, this rebuking, which would be, shaming for her. So next time we're going to see the response. I intend to finish this passage next time. Jesus will say, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? And we'll commend her, and we'll also talk about the poor who they have mentioned. And so Jesus will say, you can do good for them whenever you want. Now, again, there's some ambiguity there. If they sincerely want to do good for the poor, well, yeah, then you can do that, Jesus says. Or maybe they don't really care about the poor, and Jesus then could mean this sarcastically. Again, Mark doesn't tell us, but we do get this stern rebuke here, ending this part of our handout here with 14:5. We'll move on next time to verse 6. Let me see if you have any questions or comments before we wrap up here, and we'll wrap up in just a moment here. Yeah, somebody says, this is a great point. The fact that she had that valuable perfume says something about the woman's status and wealth. She had it available and not yet opened, etc. Yeah, great point, right? Yeah, here's another great point too. Yeah, this is great observation. They scold her but never address Jesus. Yeah, and I think there's a lot there, and I'd love to. I will be reflecting on that on my own afterwards. But yep, there's a lot there. Yeah, here's another. Someone says they grumble amongst themselves. Back to the pros heautus. Yeah, that's fascinating. I will definitely be thinking about the fact that they scold her but never address Jesus. Now, Jesus, and we've seen this before, but Jesus does not always accept the terms of engagement that have been presented to him. So to your point, they're not speaking to Jesus, but he speaks to them because he wants to. Does Jesus speak to the woman? Well, he's speaking about her at least in public, so it's very affirming. But yeah, Jesus, you might ask him a question, and he might ask you a question instead of answering your question. They might speak to the woman, he might speak to them. So that's what we're maybe used to seeing in Mark. Great. All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for the great comments and questions. This session was recorded, and if you are watching on a recording, just to remind you, you can get this handout here at the tiny URL. You can email me, abramkj@accordancebible.com. I'm going to stay on for just a moment after we end the recording, but for those of you watching on the recording, and for all of you, thanks so much for being here today.